3 weeks after my son told me I was too traditional to attend his modern wedding, he stood speechless in the empty vineyard he'd planned to use, the one I'd quietly sold to a developer. I handed him the deed showing my name as the sole owner for the past 40 years. Some lessons about respect and family heritage can only be taught through consequences. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was born Eleanor Victoria Blackwood in 1953 in the small agricultural community of Willowbrook Valley, California. Unlike the glossy postcard images of California's beaches and palm trees, our region was defined by rolling hills covered with orchards and vineyards that had sustained families for generations. My father, Thomas Blackwood, was a third-generation viticulturist who had transformed a modest family operation into one of the region's most respected small vineyards through dedication, innovation, and an uncompromising commitment to quality over quantity. Blackwood soil grows Blackwood values, my father would often say as he knelt beside me in the vineyard rows, teaching me to test the soil composition with more than just scientific instruments. You have to feel the earth between your fingers. Ellie, the land tells you what it needs if you know how to listen. Our vineyard, Blackwood Estate, encompassed 75 acres of prime land that had been in our family since my great-grandfather purchased it in 1887. What made our operation unique wasn't its size. Many corporate vineyards in the region dwarfed ours, but the relationship my father had cultivated between the land, the vines, and the people who tended them. Where larger operations focused on mechanization and volume, Blackwood grapes were still harvested by hand, with many of the same families returning season after season, their children working alongside mine just as their parents had worked alongside my father. The heart of our property was a stone winery building constructed by my great-grandfather using materials quarried from the land itself. The massive oak doors had been hand-carved with grape motifs that told our family's story. Immigration from Italy, the early struggles during Prohibition when we'd survived by producing sacramental wine and grape juice, and the gradual establishment of our reputation for wines that express the unique character of our particular soil and microclimate. Inside that building, my father had created a special room dedicated to the art and science of winemaking. Its walls were lined with leather-bound journals documenting every harvest since 1887, rainfall patterns, temperature fluctuations, pruning decisions, and tasting notes that created an unbroken record of our family's relationship with the land. Beside these journals stood a collection of bottles, one from each vintage, carefully preserved to track how our wines evolved over decades. Wine isn't made in a single season, Ellie, my father explained when I was 12, carefully extracting a cork from a bottle produced the year I was born. What you're tasting now began with decisions made by your grandfather, was influenced by weather patterns from decades ago, and will continue changing long after we're gone. That's why we don't chase trends or quick profits. We're building something that outlasts any of us individually. This perspective, prioritizing multi-generational stewardship over immediate returns, shaped every aspect of our family's approach to both business and life. When agricultural conglomerates began acquiring neighboring vineyards in the 1960s, offering substantial buyouts to families struggling with succession planning or economic pressures, my father steadfastly refused increasingly generous offers. "Land is the only thing they aren't making any more of," he would respond to puzzled neighbors who couldn't understand why he wouldn't cash in for millions. "What looks like a fortune today will seem like pocket change to your grandchildren. But if you sell their birthright, they'll never have the chance to continue what your ancestors began." This wasn't abstract philosophy, but lived practice. Every major decision, from which varietals to plant, to whether we would expand our operation, was evaluated through the lens of sustainability across generations. Profit mattered, but as a means of ensuring continuity rather than as the primary measure of success. By my 18th birthday, I had absorbed not just the technical aspects of viticulture and winemaking, but the values underpinning our family's approach. While my high school classmates departed for colleges across the country, I chose to attend the nearby University of California agricultural program, studying enology and viticulture while returning to Blackwood Estate every weekend to continue my practical education alongside academic training. It was during my junior year that I met Richard Harrison, a business student whose family had recently purchased a struggling winery about 20 miles from our estate. Where most newcomers to the industry arrived with aggressive modernization plans and marketing strategies aimed at quick recognition, Richard demonstrated unusual respect for the established wisdom of multi-generational operations like ours. "My father knows how to make money," he admitted during one of his frequent visits to observe our harvesting techniques. "But we're learning that wine is about more than efficient production and clever branding. There's knowledge embedded in these older operations that no business school teaches." What began as professional consultation evolved gradually into deeper connection. Richard's genuine curiosity about our family's approach, questions that went beyond technical processes to the underlying values guiding our decisions, revealed someone who understood that Blackwood Estate represented more than just a business operation. Our courtship unfolded against the backdrop of changing seasons in the vineyard, conversations deepening alongside the developing complexity of wines aging in barrels my great-grandfather had crafted. We married in 1976, with the ceremony held beneath ancient oak trees that had witnessed 4 generations of my family's stewardship. Rather than establishing a separate household, Richard joined me at Blackwood Estate, bringing fresh perspective that complemented our traditions without attempting to replace them. His business acumen helped modernize our record-keeping and distribution systems, while my family's generational knowledge guided our continued focus on quality and sustainability. Our son Michael was born in 1980, his early life shaped by the rhythms of the vineyard just as mine had been. His first steps were taken between rows of vines planted the year of my birth, his childhood marked by the seasonal cycles of pruning, bud break, veraison, and harvest. From his earliest days, we incorporated him into the operation in age-appropriate ways. First simply experiencing the sensory environment of the winery, then helping with simple tasks, and gradually learning the complex interplay of factors that distinguished our wines from mass-produced alternatives. "You're not just learning how to make wine, Michael," Richard would explain as they tested sugar levels in ripening grapes. "You're learning how to think across time frames most businesses never consider. The decisions we make this season will still be influencing this vineyard when your own children are standing where you are now." As Michael grew, he displayed natural aptitude for both the agricultural and business aspects of our operation. By high school, he could identify subtle variations in soil composition across different sections of the vineyard and articulate how these would influence the character of wines produced from each area. He absorbed the technical knowledge readily, showing particular interest in how emerging technologies could enhance traditional practices without fundamentally altering our approach to quality and sustainability. The true test of Michael's understanding came when he turned 18 and, like generations of Blackwoods before him, received symbolic ownership of a small section of the vineyard to manage independently within our larger operation. This tradition, dating back to my great-grandfather, provided each new generation with practical experience in decision-making while still benefiting from the guidance of established wisdom. Michael approached this responsibility with enthusiasm that suggested genuine appreciation for the legacy he was joining. His innovations, introducing limited organic certification for his section, experimenting with sustainable pest management techniques, demonstrated thoughtful evolution rather than rejection of established practices. When discussions about his college education arose, he expressed clear intention to follow my path, combining formal agricultural training with continued practical involvement at Blackwood Estate. "The vineyard is in my blood," he declared during one family dinner, raising a glass of wine produced from the vines his grandfather had planted. "I can't imagine doing anything else with my life." These words, so aligned with our family's values, and hopes gave us confidence that the Blackwood legacy would continue uninterrupted through yet another generation. We had no way of knowing that forces beyond our control, economic pressures, changing cultural values, and unexpected personal influences, would soon test this apparent certainty in ways we couldn't have anticipated. The foundation was laid, the values transmitted, the legacy seemingly secured. But as we would eventually discover, even the deepest roots can be threatened when the soil around them shifts dramatically enough. The first subtle signs of change in Michael's relationship with Blackwood Estate emerged gradually, almost imperceptibly, like the slow transformation of grapevines through the seasons. Individual moments seemed insignificant: a missed harvest, planning meeting, casual remarks about outdated techniques, increasing delegation of traditional responsibilities to hired managers. But together they formed a pattern I recognized from neighboring vineyards where generational transitions had ultimately failed. The catalyst for more profound shift arrived in 2010, when Michael attended an exclusive wine technology conference in Napa Valley. He returned transformed, his conversations suddenly peppered with new terminology: precision viticulture, algorithmic fermentation protocols, brand positioning strategies, that reflected fundamentally different approach to winemaking than the one our family had practiced for generations. "The industry is evolving faster than we realized," he explained during a family dinner where he presented elaborate PowerPoint slides rather than simply discussing his observations as we had always done. "Blackwood needs comprehensive modernization if we're going to remain relevant in today's market." Richard, whose business background made him naturally receptive to innovation, found many of Michael's proposals intriguing. "I recognize the value in certain technological advancements while harboring deeper concerns about the underlying shift in philosophy they represented. From wine as expression of particular place and tradition to wine as manufactured product, engineered to meet predetermined flavor profiles and market categories. Modernization has always been part of our approach," I reminded Michael gently. "Your great-grandfather incorporated cement fermentation tanks when they represented cutting-edge technology. Your grandfather installed temperature control systems decades before they became industry standard. The question isn't whether we adapt, but whether specific changes enhance or diminish what makes Blackwood wines distinctive." Michael's response revealed concerning misunderstanding of our family's historical relationship with innovation. "That's exactly my point. Our ancestors were forward-thinking. They wouldn't want us clinging to outdated methods just because that's how we've always done it." This characterization, reducing generations of thoughtful balance between tradition and innovation to mere nostalgic resistance, suggested fundamental disconnect from the values underlying our approach. Where our family had always evaluated potential changes against their impact on wine quality and long-term sustainability, Michael increasingly emphasized efficiency, market positioning, and industry trends in his analysis. The first major conflict erupted over Founders Hill, the historic 5-acre parcel containing our oldest vines and most traditional winemaking facility. During early spring planning session, Michael casually announced his intention to remove these heritage vines and replant with fashionable varietals more aligned with current consumer preferences. "These ancient Sangiovese vines are fascinating, historically, but they're commercially inefficient," he explained, displaying spreadsheet comparing production costs against revenue generation. "The Founders Reserve represents less than 3% of our total production, but consumes nearly 15% of our labor resources. Replanting with higher-yielding clones on modern trellising systems would triple output while reducing maintenance costs by half." The proposal struck at the heart of our family's philosophy. Founders Reserve wasn't primarily commercial product, but living connection to our origins, tangible link between past, present, and future that embodied values transcending quarterly profit calculations. The fact that Michael could reduce it to mere production statistics suggested fundamental misunderstanding of its significance. Founders Hill isn't just another vineyard block, I responded, struggling to maintain composure despite emotional impact of his suggestion. Those vines connect us directly to your great-great-grandfather's homeland. The wine they produce isn't supposed to be high-volume product or even significant revenue generator. It's physical embodiment of our heritage and reminder of what makes Blackwood distinctive. That's exactly the kind of romantic thinking that's holding us back, Michael countered, professional detachment in his tone suggesting he viewed himself as objective business manager rather than latest steward in generational continuity. We can honor heritage through marketing narratives and tasting room displays without maintaining commercially inefficient production methods. Richard, who had remained largely neutral during initial discussions of modernization, intervened with diplomatic perspective reflecting his unique position, bridging different generations and backgrounds. There may be middle path here. What if we preserve section of the original vines as living museum, while gradually transitioning remainder of Founders Hill to more commercially viable production? We could maintain connection to our heritage while addressing legitimate business concerns. This compromise temporarily diffused immediate tension while revealing deeper issue that would continue shaping family dynamics in subsequent years. The fact that Founders Hill, physical embodiment of our foundational values, required defense against internal threat, rather than external pressure, signaled significant shift in Michael's relationship with family legacy. The underlying disconnect might have remained manageable had it been confined to business operations. However, personal development soon accelerated growing divergence in values and perspectives. In summer of 2011, Michael attended industry conference in New York, where he met Vanessa Caldwell, marketing director for multinational wine and spirits conglomerate with holdings throughout major wine regions worldwide. Their relationship developed rapidly, with Vanessa making frequent visits to California and Michael spending increasing time in New York. Within 6 months, they announced their engagement, with wedding planned for following spring. While I welcomed Vanessa warmly, recognizing that our family had always grown stronger through integration of new perspectives, subtle indicators suggested she viewed Blackwood Estate primarily as underdeveloped business asset, rather than living heritage. The property has such untapped potential, she commented during her first extended visit, designer heels awkwardly navigating between vineyard rows as Michael showed her the operation. With the right positioning and facility upgrades, you could easily transition from regional producer to destination winery, generating significant hospitality revenue. Her background shaping corporate wine brands had developed perspective fundamentally different from our family's approach. Where we measured success through quality, sustainability, and generational continuity, she evaluated opportunities through frameworks prioritizing brand visibility, market penetration, and return on investment. Neither perspective was inherently wrong, but they reflected substantially different value systems and purposes. The increasing influence of this perspective became evident in Michael's evolving language when discussing Blackwood's future. References to family legacy and distinctive quality were gradually replaced with terms like brand equity and market positioning. Proposals for substantial changes accelerated, converting historic barrel room into event space, replacing century-old fermentation tanks with more photogenic equipment regardless of functional impact, developing luxury accommodations on land historically dedicated to wildlife habitat, supporting vineyards' natural predator-prey balance. Each suggestion reflected fundamentally different understanding of what Blackwood Estate was for, transitioning from working vineyard expressing particular place and heritage to lifestyle brand leveraging agricultural aesthetic for primarily non-agricultural purposes. The differences weren't merely semantic, but reflected competing visions for property's identity and purpose. Richard, whose business background might have predicted alignment with modernization agenda, found himself increasingly concerned about the direction these changes represented. During private conversation walking the property perimeter one evening, he expressed perspectives that surprised me with their philosophical depth. I came from development background, where we routinely converted properties to their highest and best use according to market metrics, he acknowledged, pausing to examine gnarled old vine we had pruned together for decades. But I've learned something profound from your family's approach, that commercial value isn't always highest value, and financial metrics can't capture certain forms of wealth that matter across generations. Vanessa's influence became increasingly evident in wedding plans that emerged over subsequent months. Rather than simple ceremony in the vineyard where generations of Blackwoods had celebrated significant life events, they envisioned elaborate destination weekend at Blackwood Estate, transformed into luxury venue. Preliminary discussions described comprehensive property modifications, temporary structures covering historic equipment, removal of productive vines to accommodate parking, commercial catering facilities installed in winemaking spaces that would effectively suspend actual vineyard operations for months surrounding event. We're going to showcase Blackwood to influencers from across the industry, Michael explained during family dinner where these plans were first detailed. This isn't just personal celebration, but strategic marketing opportunity to reposition the brand for our next phase. The characterization of family wedding as marketing vehicle reflected concerning shift in how Michael understood the property and its purpose. What had been home and livelihood embodying specific values had been mentally transformed into backdrop for image cultivation and brand development. The fact that actual wine production, ostensibly the operation's purpose, would be disrupted seemed secondary to impression management objectives. Most concerning aspect of evolving plans was location chosen for ceremony itself. Founders Hill, with its heritage vines and traditional winemaking facility. The proposed staging would require removing historic equipment, temporarily covering stone walls with decorative facades, and installing elaborate temporary flooring over ground my great-grandfather had cultivated by hand. The physical embodiment of our origins would be literally covered to create more photogenic setting aligned with contemporary event aesthetics. I raised concerns quietly, aware that wedding conversations carry emotional weight, transcending normal family discussions. Founders Hill has tremendous significance beyond scenic backdrop. Perhaps we could consider vineyard pavilion area for ceremony. It already has infrastructure for events without requiring modifications to historically important spaces. Michael's response revealed how completely perspective had shifted. That's exactly why we've chosen Founders Hill. Its historical narrative provides perfect authentic storytelling element for the event concept. Vanessa's stylist has designed incredible transformation that honors vintage aesthetic while creating Instagram-worthy moments for our guests. This framing, reducing family heritage to authentic storytelling element and vintage aesthetic within event concept, demonstrated fundamental disconnect from values the space actually embodied. The history wasn't narrative device, but lived reality. The aesthetic wasn't design choice, but physical manifestation of purposeful function. The proposed transformation wouldn't honor this reality, but temporarily obscure it behind carefully curated presentation prioritizing appearance over substance. As wedding planning accelerated, broader changes to vineyard operations reflected similar prioritization. Sections previously dedicated to experimental sustainability practices were converted to more visually appealing landscaping. Production areas visible from proposed event spaces underwent cosmetic renovations, emphasizing photogenic quality over functional efficiency. Resources that might have supported crucial vineyard maintenance were redirected toward creating impression rather than sustaining actual winemaking excellence. Tensions reached critical point during planning meeting 6, months before scheduled wedding date. The event coordinator Vanessa had engaged, specialist in luxury brand events with limited understanding of working agricultural operations, presented elaborate proposal requiring fundamental modifications to Founders Hill that went beyond temporary installations to permanent structural changes. The authentic stone walls are perfect, but we'll need to widen doorways for proper guest flow, she explained. displaying architectural renderings showing historic entryways altered to accommodate event traffic patterns. And we'll replace the original floor with something more suitable for formal attire. These rough stones are charming but impractical for women in heels. The suggestion of permanent alterations to building constructed by my great-grandfather's hands, modifications prioritizing single-day event convenience over century of functional purpose, represented line I could not allow crossed without. Response. The winery building wasn't blank canvas for event design, but physical embodiment of family heritage, not confined to abstract storytelling, but literally built into its walls and foundations. These aren't decorative features that can be modified for event convenience, I explained, maintaining calm tone despite growing internal distress. The doorways were specifically sized for wine barrels made on the property. The floor stones were quarried by my great-grandfather from this hillside. They're not design elements. They're integral to both the building's history and its function. The coordinator's dismissive response. We can document the original features through photography before modifications, suggested fundamental misunderstanding of living heritage versus mere historical documentation. The significance wasn't that these elements had once existed, but that they continued functioning as intended across generations, connecting past craftsmanship to present purpose in tangible, unbroken lineage. Michael's intervention revealed how completely values disconnect had developed. Mom's being a bit precious about these details. We're not demolishing anything, just updating historical elements to serve contemporary needs while maintaining visual authenticity. The modifications are actually protecting heritage by making the space more functional for modern purposes. 3. Months before scheduled wedding date, following particularly tense planning meeting, Michael requested private conversation on Founders Hill, the very location where philosophical differences had become most visible. As evening sunset illuminated heritage vines planted by my great-grandfather, Michael outlined perspective that clarified how completely his understanding had diverged from family legacy. I've been thinking about Blackwood's future beyond just the wedding. Vanessa and I have been developing comprehensive transition plan that would optimize the property's potential while allowing you and Dad comfortable retirement. The proposal he outlined represented complete reimagining of Blackwood Estate, converting significant acreage from production vineyards to luxury accommodations, developing portion of Founders Hill as exclusive residential community for wealthy wine enthusiasts, outsourcing actual production to contract facilities while maintaining showcase winery for visitor experiences. The land that had sustained 5 generations as working agricultural enterprise would be fundamentally repurposed as lifestyle brand leveraging viticultural heritage for primarily non-agricultural purposes. This approach makes perfect sense financially, he explained, displaying familiar confidence in data-driven analysis. Land values for luxury development far exceed agricultural returns, especially in this region. We'd maintain small demonstration, vineyard for authenticity, but transition from production focus to experience-based model leveraging the Blackwood heritage story. This framing, Blackwood heritage story, rather than living legacy, demonstration vineyard, rather than working agricultural enterprise, revealed how completely Michael's perspective had shifted from actual stewardship to narrative management. The property would maintain superficial viticultural elements as branding features, while abandoning substantive commitment to quality winemaking that had defined our family for generations. This isn't what your grandfather envisioned when he dedicated his life to this land, I finally responded, emotion tightening my voice despite efforts at measured response. Or what your great-grandfather intended when he selected this specific hillside for qualities that would produce distinctive wines, not luxury home sites. The purpose wasn't creating marketable lifestyle brand, but expressing particular place through wines that couldn't be made anywhere else. Michael's dismissive response crystallized the fundamental divergence in our perspectives. That's precisely the problem with how we've been operating. We've been making decisions based on what dead people might have wanted rather than maximizing current potential. Sentimentality is luxury we can no longer afford in competitive modern market. As conversation continued, Michael outlined specific plans for transforming property, including detailed development timeline commencing immediately after wedding. The ceremony itself, previously positioned as celebration embracing family heritage, was revealed as strategic marketing event launching property's transition to new identity. Industry influencers and potential investors had been deliberately included on guest list, with specific post-ceremony presentations planned to introduce development. Opportunities? We already have interested parties for the residential parcels, he explained with unmistakable excitement, that confirmed how deeply he believed in this vision, despite its fundamental contradiction of family values. Several luxury hospitality groups are competing for partnership opportunity. The Blackwood name carries significant equity we haven't properly leveraged. As sunset faded into twilight, Michael delivered statement that revealed final dimension of his repositioned understanding. I'm not asking permission for these changes, Mom. I'm informing you of decisions that have already been set in motion. The development partners are secured, preliminary approvals are underway, and contracts are being finalized. As managing partner with controlling interest in Blackwood operations, I'm implementing transition that should have happened years ago. This assertion that he possessed controlling interest, justifying unilateral transformation of five-generation family legacy, reflected misunderstanding with both philosophical and legal dimensions. Philosophically, it reduced stewardship, responsibility to mere ownership authority, contradicting value system that had always viewed property as trust, transcending individual control. Legally, it made assumption about formal ownership that reflected convenient interpretation rather than documented reality. I maintained composed exterior despite internal recognition that relationship had reached irreversible inflection point. The divergence wasn't merely about business strategy or aesthetic preferences, but about fundamental values determining what Blackwood Estate was for and who had responsibility for its continuity. The wedding that might have represented evolutionary integration of new perspectives into established legacy had been revealed as vehicle for revolutionary transformation, contradicting its essential character. The following morning, I visited our family attorney, the same firm that had handled Blackwood's legal matters for 3 generations, and requested comprehensive review of property documentation dating back to original purchase. This wasn't reactive impulse, but necessary clarification of legal reality that would inform appropriate response to values crisis that transcended mere philosophical disagreement. What emerged from this review contradicted narrative Michael had, evidently constructed regarding his authority to implement fundamental transformation. While operational management had increasingly shifted to his direction, actual property ownership remained vested primarily with Richard and me, with Michael, holding minority interest gradually transferred as part of estate planning process. The controlling interest he had claimed reflected aspiration rather than documentation, assumption rather than legal reality. 2 weeks before scheduled wedding date, during meeting with wedding coordinator finalizing ceremony details, Michael casually mentioned significant modification to family participation that revealed how completely perspectives had diverged. We've restructured the ceremony to better align with our contemporary aesthetic, he explained while reviewing updated timeline. Traditional elements have been minimized to create more visually cohesive experience. Mom, we've arranged for you to manage the heritage display in the reception area rather than participating in the ceremony itself. Your traditional perspectives don't really fit the modern celebration we're creating. This exclusion, from ceremony occurring on land my family had cultivated for 5 generations, in building my great-grandfather had constructed with his own hands, represented more than personal slight. It symbolized fundamental rejection of the intergenerational perspective that had defined our family's approach to both business and life, positioning heritage as museum artifact rather than living, continuity connecting past to future through present stewardship. The heritage display will showcase historical elements while maintaining aesthetic consistency, Vanessa added, her marketing background evident in terminology, disconnecting substance from appearance. We've curated artifacts telling the Blackwood story without disrupting the contemporary visual experience we're creating for our guests. Eleanor's traditional presentation would create stylistic dissonance with our modern concept. The moment crystallized philosophical divergence that had been developing gradually through preceding months. What I understood as living tradition, requiring responsible stewardship, Michael and Vanessa interpreted as curated narrative elements selectively incorporated into fundamentally different vision. The wedding that might have represented evolutionary integration of new perspectives into established legacy had been fully revealed as vehicle for revolutionary transformation, contradicting its essential character, rather than immediate confrontation that might permanently damage family relationships. I maintained a composed exterior while internally recognizing an irreversible inflection point had been reached. The announcement that I would be managing the heritage display, rather than participating in my son's wedding ceremony, struck me with physical force I carefully concealed behind decades of practiced dignity. I understand your vision for the celebration, I responded with a poise that masked the profound pain their exclusion had triggered. Please excuse me. There are matters requiring my attention before the event. This measured response reflected values my father had modeled throughout similar transitions. Restraint, perspective-taking, recognition that emotional reaction rarely produces constructive resolution. As I walked from the meeting room through the winery my great-grandfather had built stone by stone, I allowed myself to fully absorb what had just transpired. I wasn't being excluded from my son's wedding merely because my appearance might disrupt their carefully curated aesthetic. I was being symbolically removed from the family narrative they were constructing, a narrative that treated our heritage as marketable backdrop rather than lived experience, that positioned our multi-generational wisdom as museum artifact rather than guiding philosophy. The heritage display I'd been assigned to manage represented their fundamental misunderstanding of what legacy actually means. That evening, I sat alone in the small archive room where generations of Blackwoods had maintained meticulous records of each harvest, vintage, and seasonal observation. The leather-bound journals dating back to 1887 weren't merely historical curiosities, but living documentation of relationship with particular place. The accumulated wisdom that enabled thoughtful stewardship across rapidly changing agricultural, economic, and social conditions. My father's distinctive handwriting filled dozens of volumes, his observations about weather patterns, soil conditions, and fermentation characteristics reflecting scientific precision inseparable from deep-rooted connection to land whose particularities he understood with intuitive familiarity, born from lifetime engagement. Beside his journals stood my own documentation, continuing unbroken record connecting generations through shared purpose, transcending individual lifetimes. The room itself embodied exactly what Michael and Vanessa failed to comprehend about heritage, not simply appealing historical narrative or aesthetic backdrop, but functional wisdom connecting past insights to future possibilities through present responsibility. The archives weren't decoration but practical resource guiding decisions with implications extending far beyond quarterly spreadsheets or marketing trends. What they dismissed as sentimental attachment represented sophisticated knowledge system, balancing innovation and continuity through changing circumstances. As I reviewed these records, the physical manifestation of intergenerational conversation spanning more than century, clarity emerged regarding appropriate response to crisis that threatened not merely personal dignity, but fundamental purpose. 5 generations had cultivated through dedicated stewardship. The philosophical divide between Michael's vision and family legacy had reached irreconcilable culmination, requiring action aligned with both legal reality and values responsibility. The following morning, while wedding preparations continued, transforming Blackwood Estate into elaborately staged event venue, I contacted our family attorney, the same firm that had handled Blackwood's legal matters for 3 generations, to implement decision that philosophical responsibility and legal reality had made unavoidable. The documentation we had reviewed following Michael's pronouncement about controlling interest had revealed something I had nearly forgotten. The 5-acre parcel containing Founders Hill, with its heritage vines and historical winery building, had remained specifically in my name when property interests were partially distributed during estate planning process. This wasn't accidental oversight but deliberate protection of family's origin point, maintaining direct connection between founding generation and current stewardship. My father had insisted on this arrangement during estate planning discussions years earlier, his foresight providing structural protection for philosophical values that transcended individual generations or external pressures. Some pieces of land carry meaning beyond their acreage or production value, he had explained while reviewing distribution plans with our attorney. Founders Hill isn't primarily financial asset, but physical embodiment of our origins and purpose. It should remain under direct stewardship, most aligned with those foundational values, regardless of broader operational transitions. This legal reality, that ceremonial venue Michael had committed to development partners without consultation or appropriate authority, created concrete foundation for response to philosophical crisis threatening generational legacy. With documentation confirming sole ownership, I authorized confidential exploration of options that would permanently protect founding property from development plans, contradicting its essential purpose while creating necessary boundary defining acceptable limits of modernization that erased rather than evolved core values. I approached this decision not with vengeful impulse or reactionary emotion, but with same careful consideration our family had applied to significant transitions throughout its history. The question wasn't simply legal rights or personal dignity, but fundamental responsibility to both past and future generations, connected through values embedded in physical property facing transformation, contradicting its essential character. After reviewing several possibilities with both legal counsel and conservation specialists, framework emerged that aligned philosophical values with practical implementation. Rather than standard sale to highest bidder or confrontational legal maneuver, the approach centered on agricultural conservation easement transferred to regional land trust dedicated to preserving working agricultural properties facing development, pressure in increasingly gentrified wine country. This structure would legally protect Founders Hill from development in perpetuity while maintaining active viticultural purpose aligned with heritage vines' historical significance. The conservation easement wouldn't prevent contemporary winemaking innovations where appropriate, but would permanently prohibit non-agricultural development or practices fundamentally contradicting property's essential character. Most importantly, this approach transcended merely reactive boundary setting to embrace constructive purpose aligned with broader community values. By incorporating educational provisions ensuring traditional viticultural practices would be documented and shared with future winemakers, the arrangement extended family values beyond property ownership into living knowledge, preserving, disappearing. Wisdom increasingly marginalized by corporatized industry prioritizing efficiency over distinctiveness. The transaction required meticulous preparation, both legally and philosophically. Working with conservation specialists, we developed comprehensive documentation of heritage vines' genetic significance, traditional winemaking approaches' distinctive characteristics, and historical structures' architectural importance. This wasn't merely technical requirement for conservation easement, but philosophical framework, articulating values transcending financial calculations that had always guided Blackwood's development. As wedding preparations accelerated around me, temporary structures rising across property, production areas transformed into entertainment venues, historical elements selectively curated for marketing narrative, I maintained deliberate restraint in both actions and communications. The transaction proceeded quietly but legitimately, with proper legal process unfolding without disruption to celebration planning that, despite philosophical differences, remained significant life milestone for my son, regardless of contextual conflicts. The conservation easement documents were finalized 3 days before scheduled wedding ceremony. their signing accompanied not by confrontational announcement, but quiet satisfaction, knowing family's founding legacy would remain protected. Regardless of operational changes or ownership transitions Michael might implement elsewhere on property. The legal structure ensured Founders Hill would continue expressing values that had defined Blackwood for generations, even if broader vineyard operations evolved in directions prioritizing different considerations. I made no immediate announcement regarding completed transaction, allowing final wedding preparations to continue without disruption that would affect numerous innocent participants in celebration that retained personal significance despite philosophical context. The revelation would occur organically through normal property activities rather than orchestrated confrontation that might unnecessarily escalate already complex family dynamics. The unveiling occurred unexpectedly during final venue inspection, 2 days before ceremony. Michael and Vanessa had arranged meeting with development partners to finalize post-wedding transition timeline for Founders Hill residential project, the centerpiece of their reimagined Blackwood lifestyle community, leveraging viticultural aesthetic while minimizing actual agricultural production. As they approached winery building with architectural team prepared to begin measuring for permanent modifications, they encountered land trust representatives conducting baseline documentation required for conservation easement implementation. The confusion. This unexpected encounter quickly transformed into focused questioning as Michael attempted to understand these strangers' presence on what he had mentally incorporated into development plans without appropriate consultation or authority. The land trust director, experienced conservation professional accustomed to complex property transitions, explained their role documenting protected property's existing conditions before easement took full effect following wedding events. There must be misunderstanding, Michael responded with professional smoothness, masking growing concern. Founders Hill is centerpiece of our development program commencing next month. There's no conservation easement involved in our planning. The documentation the director respectfully presented, complete with my legitimate signature as sole, legal owner of specific parcel, created moment of shocked silence, followed by rapid recalibration, as Michael absorbed implications contradicting assumptions he had maintained, despite earlier legal clarification. The property central to his development vision, the historic venue where ceremony would occur in 48 hours, had been permanently protected from exactly the transformation he had been actively marketing to potential investors. His immediate impulse led him to my private office in estate's main residence, controlled anger visible beneath professional demeanor as he confronted what he perceived as deliberate sabotage rather than principled stewardship. I received him with calm composure, reflecting values my father had modeled throughout similar transitions: dignity without defensiveness, clarity without confrontation, principle without pettiness. "How could you implement conservation easement without consulting me?" he demanded, documents clutched in hand as physical evidence contradicting narrative of controlling authority he had constructed. "This completely undermines development program we've been planning for months. The residential community can't proceed without Founders Hill as centerpiece connecting heritage narrative to luxury lifestyle positioning." This framing, heritage, narrative as marketing feature within luxury lifestyle positioning, crystallized philosophical disconnect that had made intervention necessary. What 5 generations had built as purposeful expression of particular place and values had been mentally transformed into branding element within fundamentally different enterprise disconnected from its original meaning and function. "I haven't undermined anything, Michael," I responded with genuine rather than strategic calm. "I've protected property that has always embodied our family's foundational values from transformation, contradicting its essential character and purpose. The easement ensures Founders Hill will continue functioning as working vineyard, expressing particular place through traditional methods that have defined Blackwood for generations." The documentation I presented, complementing conservation easement, detailed both legal authority for decision and philosophical framework supporting it. The 5-acre parcel had remained specifically in my name through previous estate planning, specifically to protect founding legacy from potential pressures contradicting its purpose. Legal reality Michael had conveniently overlooked despite previous clarification. The easement itself didn't prevent wedding celebration as planned, but permanently prohibited subsequent development that would have fundamentally altered property's agricultural character and historic structures. The wedding can proceed exactly as scheduled, I assured him, recognizing legitimate concern about imminent celebration, regardless of longer-term implications. Nothing has changed regarding ceremony logistics or facility access. The easement simply ensures Founders Hill will continue fulfilling purpose for which it was originally established, rather than being converted to residential development, contradicting its essential character. Michael's reaction revealed how completely perspectives had diverged despite shared family connection. Rather than recognizing legitimate exercise of both legal authority and philosophical responsibility, he interpreted action as personal betrayal, prioritizing outdated sentimentality over practical opportunity. The fact that development partners had been actively engaged without confirming fundamental ownership questions reflected concerning prioritization of strategic positioning over basic due diligence. "This changes everything," he stated with cold, professional detachment replacing earlier emotional reaction. "You've deliberately undermined months of planning and development partnerships based on romantic attachment to outdated production methods that have no place in modern wine business. This isn't protecting legacy. It's sabotaging progress that would secure Blackwood's relevance for future generations." This framing, romantic attachment versus progress, relevance defined primarily through commercial metrics, revealed how completely we understood family legacy through different frameworks. What I experienced as living tradition requiring responsible stewardship, he interpreted as negotiable narrative resource within business strategy prioritizing contemporary market positioning over intergenerational continuity. "I understand you see this differently," I acknowledged, respecting legitimacy of alternate perspective while maintaining clarity about principles guiding my decision. But Blackwood was never primarily business enterprise maximizing financial returns. It was physical manifestation of specific philosophy viewing land as responsibility rather than primarily investment vehicle. The easement ensures that foundational purpose remains protected regardless of how broader operations might evolve. The wedding coordinator interrupted our conversation with logistical questions requiring immediate attention, temporarily suspending philosophical discussion that had reached irreconcilable impasse. Michael departed with professional composure masking evident tension, his focus shifting pragmatically toward imminent celebration, despite longer-term implications for development plans that had been revealed as fundamentally impossible in their current form. Over subsequent 36 hours, wedding preparations continued with increasing intensity, temporary structures transforming Blackwood Estate from working vineyard into elaborate event venue, accommodating hundreds of guests arriving from across country and beyond. Throughout this controlled chaos, I maintained deliberate restraint, fulfilling responsibilities, facilitating preparations, avoiding unnecessary conflict that might disrupt celebration regardless of contextual tensions. The evening before ceremony, as final rehearsals concluded and last-minute adjustments addressed inevitable logistical complications, Vanessa requested private conversation away from coordinating teams and family members navigating complex emotional and practical dimensions of imminent celebration. Her marketing background typically manifested through carefully maintained professional persona, regardless of circumstances, making this unusual request particularly significant. We met in small garden courtyard my mother had established decades earlier, its intimate scale and thoughtful design creating space conducive to meaningful conversation sheltered from surrounding activity. As twilight transformed brilliant California sunshine into softer golden light, filtering through ancient olive trees transplanted from Italian hillside by my great-grandfather, Vanessa's carefully maintained professional composure showed subtle fractures revealing genuine emotion rather than strategic positioning. "I want to discuss your participation in tomorrow's ceremony," she began with uncharacteristic hesitation, suggesting internal conflict rather than confident certainty typically characterizing her communication. The heritage display arrangement was primarily Michael's idea, not mine. He believes maintaining aesthetic consistency requires minimizing traditional elements that might disrupt contemporary visual concept we've developed. This acknowledgement, separating her perspective from decision, excluding me from ceremony, suggested potential opening transcending apparently irreconcilable philosophical divide that had developed around property's purpose and meaning. Though her professional background naturally aligned with marketing-oriented approach Michael had increasingly embraced, her personal values apparently maintained greater complexity than purely commercial framework might suggest. "The ceremony should reflect what matters most to you and Michael," I responded, genuine rather than strategic generosity guiding interaction despite painful exclusion had created. "My concern involves broader transformation of Blackwood's purpose and character, not specific wedding aesthetics or ceremonial roles." Vanessa's response revealed unexpected depth, transcending professional persona she typically projected. "I understand Michael's vision for Blackwood's future differs substantially from traditional approach your family established. The development plans reflected his perspective more than mine, though I supported his enthusiasm professionally. The conservation easement has actually created opportunity to reconsider what makes this place truly special beyond real estate potential." This acknowledgement that property's significance transcended development opportunity she had initially emphasized suggested potential bridge across philosophical divide Michael's increasingly commercial perspective had created. Though working within corporate wine industry had naturally shaped her understanding toward brand-centered frameworks, direct experience with Blackwood's distinctive character had apparently cultivated appreciation transcending purely market-oriented evaluation. Michael believes modernization requires fundamental transformation away from traditional approaches, she continued, genuine reflection replacing strategic positioning, typically characterizing her communication. "I've come to recognize that Blackwood's distinctiveness actually emerges from balance between innovation and tradition your family has always cultivated. The development vision might have transformed property into something financially successful, but ultimately indistinguishable from countless other wine-themed lifestyle communities. This perspective, recognizing value in distinctive character that transcended standardized commercial frameworks, represented potential foundation for reconciliation beyond immediate wedding context." Though Michael had increasingly interpreted heritage as marketable narrative resource within business strategy, Vanessa appeared developing appreciation for living tradition requiring ongoing stewardship rather than merely curated aesthetic for consumer experience. "I would like you to participate in ceremony tomorrow," she stated with direct clarity, contrasting sharply with previous positioning, suggesting my traditional presentation would create stylistic dissonance with their modern concept. "My role should serve celebration's purpose, rather than creating unnecessary tension," I responded, recognizing complexity surrounding imminent event despite philosophical context. "The ceremony should focus on your relationship with Michael rather than broader questions about Blackwood's future that conservation easement has necessarily raised." Our conversation concluded without specific resolution regarding ceremonial participation, mutual recognition of situation's complexity, preventing simple solution to tensions. Conservation easement had illuminated, though wedding would proceed. As planned, regardless of long-term implications for development vision Michael had been actively promoting, fundamental questions about Blackwood's essential character and purpose remained unresolved beneath surface of imminent celebration. The wedding day itself dawned with characteristic California perfection. Brilliant sunshine, moderate temperature, gentle breeze carrying subtle fragrance from heritage roses my grandmother had planted along pathways connecting residents to winery buildings and vineyard blocks. As catering teams, Photographers, event coordinators, and various specialists transformed already modified property into even more elaborately staged venue. I maintained deliberate distance, fulfilling necessary responsibilities without inserting myself into domains others now managed according to vision fundamentally different from traditional approach our family had always employed for significant celebrations. My preparation for ceremony itself reflected values my father had exemplified throughout similar transitions: dignity without pretension, respect for occasion despite philosophical context, recognition that personal feelings remained secondary to celebration's legitimate significance, regardless of surrounding tensions. The simple linen dress I selected, hand-woven fabric in deep burgundy shade, precisely matching Founder's Reserve wine produced from heritage vines, now protected through conservation easement, embodied understated elegance prioritizing substance over appearance. As guests began arriving, mixture of family connections, industry colleagues, corporate partners, and strategic relationships reflecting Michael and Vanessa's professional networks, rather than primarily personal connections, I maintained welcoming presence while observing transformation of property I had known intimately throughout my entire life. The winery building my great-grandfather had constructed with materials quarried from surrounding hillsides now served as ceremonial backdrop essentially unrecognizable beneath decorative overlays, converting working agricultural facility into theatrical set leveraging wine country aesthetic while minimizing actual functional elements. An hour before scheduled ceremony, as professionally choreographed preparations reached final stages, Michael appeared at my private quarters with unexpected request, reflecting evolution in perspective conservation easement might have initiated. "We would like you to participate in ceremony after all, not managing heritage display, but actually joining processional and standing with family during exchange of vows." This invitation, reversing previous exclusion positioning my traditional presentation as disruptive to their contemporary aesthetic, suggested potential recalibration in relationship between heritage and innovation that conservation easement had forced through necessary boundary setting. Though development vision had faced unavoidable limitation through legal protection of Founders Hill, ceremonial inclusion indicated possible recognition that legacy involved living participation, rather than merely curated artifacts within marketing narrative. "The ceremony should reflect what matters most to you and Vanessa," I responded, genuine rather than strategic generosity guiding interaction despite painful exclusion planning process had created. "My participation should serve celebration's purpose rather than creating unnecessary tension or distraction from your relationship's significance." Michael's response revealed unexpected vulnerability beneath professional persona he typically projected. "Vanessa helped me recognize that excluding you from ceremony contradicted values that actually make Blackwood distinctive. The development vision reflected legitimate business opportunity, but may have lost something essential about what this place has always represented. Your participation would honor connection between past, present, and future that conservation easement ultimately protects. This acknowledgement that property's significance transcended development opportunity he had aggressively pursued suggested potential foundation for reconciliation beyond immediate wedding context. Though conservation easement had created unavoidable limitation for transformation he had envisioned, ceremonial inclusion indicated possible recognition that family legacy involved living continuity rather than merely marketable narrative within business strategy. The ceremony itself unfolded with unexpected integration of elements representing both heritage and evolution that had always characterized Blackwood's approach to changing circumstances. My participation, walking processional path through heritage vines now permanently protected from development, symbolized connection between generations that conservation easement had structurally ensured despite philosophical differences regarding property's broader purpose and character. As Vanessa and Michael exchanged vows beneath ancient olive trees my great-grandfather had transplanted from Italian hillside, Their words reflected nuanced balance between honoring established foundations and creating distinctive path forward. The celebration that followed, though elaborate beyond traditional approach our family had typically employed, maintained meaningful connections to place and purpose that transcended merely aesthetic appreciation or marketing narrative. Throughout, reception celebrating their marriage, I observed subtle but significant shift in how Michael engaged with property and guests experiencing it for first time. Rather than emphasizing development potential or marketing positioning as previous events had increasingly featured, his interactions revealed deeper appreciation for distinctive character that balanced innovation and tradition. When introducing industry colleagues to heritage vines and historical winery building, his language acknowledged agricultural purpose and family wisdom that had shaped Blackwood's evolution across generations. "These vines connect directly to my great-great-grandfather's homeland," he explained to group touring Founders Hill following formal dinner. "The wine they produce isn't designed for mass market, but expresses particular place through methods refined over generations. The conservation easement my mother established ensures these traditional approaches will continue informing Blackwood's evolution, regardless of how broader operations might develop in future." This framing, conservation easement my mother established, rather than previous characterization as sabotage or obstruction, suggested potential reconciliation transcending immediate wedding context. Though development vision had faced unavoidable limitation through legal protection of founding property, his acknowledgement indicated possible recognition that boundary setting reflected legitimate stewardship rather than merely sentimental attachment to outdated approaches. Following wedding celebration, as guests departed and elaborate temporary structures were gradually removed, restoring property to more functional configuration, Michael requested conversation addressing longer-term implications conservation easement created for Blackwood's future direction. Rather than continuing confrontational positioning that had characterized initial response to permanent protection of Founders Hill, his approach reflected more thoughtful engagement with fundamental questions about property's purpose and character. The conservation easement creates necessary recalibration of development vision I had been pursuing, he acknowledged as we walked property perimeter following formal celebration. Though residential community can't proceed as originally conceived without Founders Hill as centerpiece, the permanent protection actually creates opportunity to develop more distinctive approach, balancing innovation and tradition rather than simply leveraging wine country aesthetic for standardized luxury development. This perspective, recognizing potential value and limitation conservation easement had established, suggested evolution beyond purely commercial framework that had increasingly shaped his understanding of family legacy. Though easement had created unavoidable boundary preventing transformation, contradicting property's agricultural character, this constraint appeared fostering more creative engagement with distinctive qualities that had always defined Blackwood approach to changing circumstances. "I still believe modernization remains essential for Blackwood's continued relevance," he continued, balanced perspective replacing previous positioning that had reduced heritage to merely marketable narrative within business strategy. "But conservation easement helps ensure modernization enhances rather than erases distinctive character that 5 generations have cultivated through thoughtful balance between innovation and tradition." The weeks following wedding brought tangible manifestation of this evolving perspective as Michael and Vanessa developed revised vision for Blackwood's future direction. Rather than fundamentally transforming property into primarily lifestyle brand with minimal agricultural production, their approach increasingly emphasized distinctive quality and sustainable practices that had always characterized our families' operations while thoughtfully incorporating appropriate innovations enhancing these foundational values. Development plans shifted from residential community leveraging wine aesthetic toward educational center, documenting traditional viticultural practices increasingly marginalized by corporatized industry. The heritage vines and historical winery building, protected through conservation easement, became centerpiece for programs sharing disappearing knowledge with next generation of winemakers, seeking alternatives to standardized approaches dominating contemporary production. The conservation easement doesn't prevent innovation, but ensures it builds upon foundation previous generations established, Michael explained during family meeting, presenting revised vision for Blackwood's evolution. Rather than abandoning traditional approaches for standardized commercial methods, we can demonstrate how thoughtful integration of appropriate technology actually enhances distinctive quality and sustainable practices that have always defined our approach. This framework, innovation enhancing rather than replacing tradition, reflected return to balanced perspective that had characterized Blackwood's development throughout previous transitions our family had navigated. Though conservation easement had created unavoidable boundary preventing transformation, contradicting property's essential character, this limitation had apparently fostered more creative engagement with distinctive qualities that transcended purely commercial evaluation. Most significantly, Michael's language when discussing Blackwood's future increasingly reflected reconnection with values that had always guided our family's approach to changing circumstances. References to brand equity and market positioning that had gradually replaced family legacy and distinctive quality in his previous framing gave way to more balanced perspective, acknowledging both commercial realities and philosophical foundations shaping property's evolution across generations. The easement creates framework, ensuring we remain working agricultural enterprise expressing particular place rather than primarily lifestyle brand leveraging wine aesthetic, he observed, during conversation reviewing conservation requirements guiding Founders Hill management. That limitation actually helps maintain distinctive character increasingly rare in industry, dominated by corporate operations prioritizing standardization over unique expression of specific terroir. The relationship between heritage and innovation that conservation easement had structurally protected through legal boundary setting gradually re-emerged as philosophical framework, guiding Blackwood's evolution beyond immediate wedding context. Though development vision had faced unavoidable limitation through permanent protection of founding property, this constraint appeared fostering more thoughtful engagement with essential character that had always distinguished our family's approach from standardized commercial operations. 6 months after wedding celebration that had temporarily transformed Blackwood Estate into elaborate event venue, property had largely returned to working agricultural enterprise balancing traditional approaches and appropriate innovations that had characterized our family's operations throughout previous transitions. The heritage vines and historical winery building protected through conservation easement continued functioning according to original purpose, producing distinctive wines through methods connecting current production to wisdom accumulated across generations. The development partnerships Michael had established before conservation easement revealed ownership limitations had evolved toward more appropriate collaborations, enhancing Blackwood's distinctive character, rather than fundamentally transforming it into standardized luxury operation. Educational programs sharing traditional viticultural practices increasingly occupied spaces previously designated for residential development, creating meaningful transmission of disappearing knowledge, otherwise marginalized by industry evolution, prioritizing efficiency over distinctive quality. Most importantly, the relationship between generations that wedding planning process had temporarily disrupted gradually healed through shared appreciation for balanced approach conservation easement had structurally ensured. Though philosophical, differences regarding specific implementations naturally remained. Fundamental recognition of Blackwood's distinctive character as requiring thoughtful integration of tradition and innovation provided framework for collaboration transcending immediate conflicts surrounding development vision easement had necessarily limited. 1 year after conservation easement had created unavoidable boundary preventing transformation contradicting property's essential character, Michael requested conversation addressing deeper dimensions of decision that had initially appeared, disrupting his development vision but increasingly seemed preserving foundation making Blackwood genuinely distinctive within homogenizing industry. "I need to acknowledge something important," he began, as we walked rows of heritage vines protected through legal framework I had established despite his initial opposition. The conservation easement I initially viewed as obstruction based on sentimental attachment to outdated approaches has actually protected what makes Blackwood truly valuable beyond merely financial calculations. This recognition that property's significance transcended development opportunity he had aggressively pursued represented meaningful reconciliation transcending immediate wedding context that had revealed fundamental disconnect between competing visions for family legacy. Though easement had created unavoidable limitation for transformation he had envisioned, lived experience following its implementation had apparently fostered appreciation for distinctive qualities standardized development might have inadvertently erased. The wedding exclusion reflected fundamental misunderstanding of what heritage actually means. He continued with remarkable self-awareness, indicating genuine evolution rather than merely strategic positioning. I had mentally transformed living, tradition requiring ongoing stewardship into marketable narrative resource within business strategy, disconnected from its essential meaning and purpose. The too traditional framing I used represented profound failure to recognize what makes Blackwood genuinely distinctive within increasingly standardized industry. This acknowledgement, that exclusion reflected fundamental misunderstanding rather than legitimate aesthetic consideration, represented meaningful healing in relationship conservation easement had necessarily strained through boundary setting protecting founding property from transformation, contradicting its essential character. Though philosophical differences naturally remained regarding specific implementations, shared recognition of Blackwood's distinctive character as requiring balanced integration of tradition and innovation provided foundation for collaboration, transcending immediate conflicts surrounding development. Vision easement had structurally limited. As we concluded walk through heritage vines my great-grandfather had planted connecting directly to European traditions he had transplanted to California soil, Michael offered perspective that suggested genuine reconciliation, transcending utilitarian. Acceptance of limitation conservation easement had created. Thank you for protecting what I couldn't yet recognize needed protection. The easement doesn't prevent progress, but ensures it builds upon foundation making Blackwood truly meaningful beyond merely commercial success. Some lessons about respect and family heritage can only be taught through consequences that initially appear limiting but ultimately reveal what matters most. This framing, consequences revealing what matters most, rather than merely creating practical limitations, represented philosophical alignment, transcending specific disagreements that would naturally continue shaping Blackwood's evolution through changing circumstances. Though conservation easement had created unavoidable boundary, preventing transformation, contradicting property's essential character, this constraint had apparently fostered deeper understanding of distinctive qualities that transcended purely commercial evaluation, increasingly dominating industry standardization. 3 years after wedding celebration that had temporarily transformed Blackwood Estate into an elaborate event venue, revealing fundamental disconnect between competing visions for property's future, vineyard operations reflected balanced approach. Conservation easement had structurally protected through permanent limitation, preventing development, contradicting agricultural character. The heritage vines and historical winery building continued functioning according to original purpose, producing distinctive wines through methods connecting current production to wisdom accumulated across generations. Michael and Vanessa had established primary residence in former caretaker's cottage, thoughtfully renovated to accommodate contemporary needs while respecting historical character, their daily lives integrated with agricultural operations rather than separated from working enterprise as development vision would have necessitated. Their daughter, born 18 months after wedding celebration, was growing up surrounded by rhythms and relationships that had shaped 5 previous generations. Her earliest experiences embedding values conservation easement had protected when they faced potential erasure through transformation, prioritizing development potential over agricultural purpose. Though philosophical differences naturally remained regarding specific implementations guiding Blackwood's navigation through changing industry circumstances, shared recognition of property's distinctive character as requiring thoughtful integration of tradition and innovation provided framework for collaboration. Transcending conflicts, conservation easement had necessarily illuminated the boundary setting that had initially appeared disruptive to Michael's development vision, increasingly seemed preserving foundation-making family legacy genuinely meaningful, beyond merely financial calculations or marketing narratives. Some inheritances can't be measured in square footage or property values, Michael observed during family gathering, celebrating completion of educational center sharing traditional viticultural practices with next generation of winemakers seeking alternatives to standardized approaches dominating contemporary production. The real legacy isn't land or buildings, but values guiding how we relate to particular place across generations. The conservation easement protects physical elements embodying those values while ensuring they continue informing how Blackwood evolves through challenges we can't yet imagine. This perspective, legacy as values guiding relationship with particular place rather than primarily financial asset or marketing narrative, represented philosophical alignment, transcending specific disagreements that would naturally continue, shaping families' engagement with property through changing circumstances. Though conservation easement had created unavoidable limitation for transformation Michael had originally envisioned, this constraint had apparently fostered deeper appreciation for distinctive qualities that transcended purely commercial evaluation, increasingly dominating industry standardization. The wedding that had temporarily revealed fundamental disconnect between competing visions for Blackwood's future ultimately initiated recalibration, preserving balanced approach that had always characterized our family's navigation through agricultural, economic, and social transitions across generations. The exclusion positioning me as too traditional for ceremony celebrating relationship on land my family had cultivated for 5 generations had illuminated philosophical divide. Requiring boundary-setting conservation easement had structurally implemented through permanent protection of founding property. The lesson provided through consequence rather than mere conversation had apparently fostered deeper understanding than philosophical discussion alone could have achieved. The conservation easement, preventing transformation, contradicting properties, essential character had created framework ensuring Blackwood would continue expressing particular place through methods balancing tradition and innovation that had always distinguished our family's approach from standardized operations increasingly dominating contemporary industry. 5 years after telling me I was too traditional for his wedding, Michael stood beside me in Heritage Vineyard permanently protected through conservation easement, watching his daughter learn pruning techniques my father had taught me on these same vines decades earlier. The property deed showing my name as sole owner of Founders Hill, document that had revealed Development Vision's fundamental impossibility, now hung framed beside conservation easement in educational center sharing traditional viticultural practices with future generations who would continue balancing innovation and tradition through challenges we couldn't yet imagine. She needs to understand that some things change and some remain foundation you build upon, he observed, as his daughter carefully followed techniques connecting her directly to great-great-great-grandfather who had planted these vines with knowledge, transplanted from Italian homeland. The easement protecting this hillside from development is probably greatest gift I didn't initially recognize as gift. Some lessons about respect and family heritage can only be taught through consequences that reveal what matters most when everything else changes. 10 years have passed since the wedding that revealed the fundamental divide in how Michael and I understood Blackwood's legacy. What began as painful exclusion, being told I was too traditional to participate in a ceremony held on land, family had cultivated for 5 generations, ultimately led to necessary boundary setting that preserved what makes our vineyard truly distinctive in an increasingly homogenized industry. Today marks the 70th anniversary of my father's full ownership of Blackwood Estate. 3 generations have gathered to commemorate this milestone, with a celebration that bears little resemblance to the elaborately orchestrated marketing event Michael and Vanessa had originally envisioned for their wedding day. Where that gathering emphasized impression management and strategic positioning, today's commemoration centers on the meaningful connection between generations that the conservation easement structurally ensured. I arrived yesterday afternoon to find Michael already at work preparing the property for our family gathering, not directing hired staff or coordinating professional services, but personally attending to the heritage vines with the quiet competence that comes from a decade of reconnection to the agricultural wisdom his earlier business-centered perspective had temporarily obscured. The integrated understanding with which he tested soil conditions and evaluated ripening fruit suggested genuine reintegration of values that had once seemed irretrievably lost beneath corporate marketing frameworks. "These vines have something important to tell us about this season," he observed as I joined him, hands stained with the same soil that had marked 5 generations of our family. "The fruit set is showing patterns my grandfather documented in 1974, conditions we haven't seen since then." I found his notes in the archive room describing exactly how they adjusted pruning techniques to compensate. This observation, connecting present conditions to documented wisdom from previous generations, represented exactly the kind of integrated knowledge the conservation easement was designed to protect. Not rigid adherence to outdated methods, but thoughtful application of accumulated experience to present challenges guided by values transcending individual lifetimes. "Your grandfather would be pleased to see his observations still providing guidance," I confirmed, grateful for these moments that bridged what had once seemed unbridgeable philosophical divide. He always said the journals weren't primarily historical records, but ongoing conversation between generations facing similar challenges in different contexts. As evening approached, our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Vanessa, with 9-year-old Sophia and 5-year-old Thomas, returning from Community Farmers Market, where Blackwood had maintained presence since my grandfather established tradition during Great Depression. Unlike the designer-clad marketing executive who had once navigated vineyard rows in inappropriate footwear while discussing untapped potential, Vanessa now moved through the property with comfortable familiarity, reflecting decade of integrated engagement with agricultural reality beneath the aesthetic surface she had once prioritized. "We sold out of everything before noon," she reported with genuine satisfaction that transcended mere commercial metrics. Sophia handled transactions while Thomas explained traditional methods to customers who've never experienced wine made without commercial additives. Several families signed up for next month's Heritage Viticulture Workshop. This engagement, educational, outreach sharing disappearing knowledge with broader community, represented significant evolution from positioning Blackwood primarily as luxury lifestyle brand. Though Vanessa's professional background naturally shaped marketing approaches incorporating contemporary communication strategies, these now served authentic agricultural mission rather than creating carefully curated narrative obscuring functional purpose beneath lifestyle aesthetics. "The Heritage Workshop series has waiting list extending 6 months, she continued, while unloading baskets containing produce exchanged with neighboring farms, maintaining similar commitment to traditional methods. "We're considering expanding educational facilities to accommodate increasing interest from young winemakers, seeking alternatives to corporate methodologies dominating industry training programs. This direction, educational outreach rather than luxury development, represented meaningful evolution from vision Michael had once pursued before conservation easement revealed ownership limitations, preventing transformation, contradicting property's essential character. The boundary setting that had initially appeared disruptive to development plans had apparently created framework within which more authentic engagement with Blackwood's distinctive qualities could flourish beyond merely financial or marketing considerations. Sophia and Thomas immediately dispersed to their respective responsibilities, integrated into property's operations through age-appropriate tasks, connecting them viscerally to agricultural reality beneath viticultural romance, often emphasizing aesthetics over actual production. Unlike passive consumers of curated wine country experience, They were active participants in working enterprise, guided by values transcending individual lifetimes that conservation easement had structurally protected when they faced potential erosion through development, prioritizing lifestyle branding over agricultural purpose. "I found great-great-grandfather's pruning shears in the archive collection," Sophia announced, presenting century-old tools maintained through generations of careful stewardship. "Can I use them for demonstration during tomorrow's ceremony?" "I've been practicing traditional techniques he developed specifically for these heritage vines." This request, utilizing historical artifacts for functional demonstration rather than merely decorative display, reflected precisely the living connection between generations that conservation easement was designed to protect. Not preservation, freezing heritage in static exhibition, but ongoing engagement, allowing accumulated wisdom to continue informing present practices through changing conditions, requiring thoughtful adaptation rather than wholesale abandonment. Those shears were designed specifically for the unique growth patterns of these Sangiovese vines, I explained, sharing context, deepening functional understanding beyond merely historical appreciation. Notice how the angle of the blade differs. From modern equipment? That's because traditional pruning methods recognized subtle differences between varietals that standardized approaches often overlook. As family gathered for dinner in courtyard connecting winery building to residence, the comfortable integration of tradition and appropriate innovation that had always characterized Blackwood's most successful periods was evident throughout physical space and interpersonal dynamics. The meal itself, featuring produce from neighboring farms maintaining similar commitment to traditional methods alongside Blackwood wines, expressing particular place through practices balanced between heritage and evolution, embodied philosophical framework the conservation easement had structurally protected when it faced potential erasure. Richard, now 82, but maintaining active involvement in aspects of operation, particularly benefiting from his business expertise, observed transformation that had occurred since contentious periods surrounding wedding and subsequent boundary setting, with characteristic perception transcending immediate circumstances. The decade since conservation easement created necessary limitation has produced more meaningful innovation than development vision might have generated despite its apparent ambition. Constraints often foster creativity that unlimited options actually inhibit. This perspective, limitations potentially enhancing rather than merely restricting possibilities, reflected wisdom Richard had developed through unique position bridging. Different backgrounds and generations throughout Blackwood's evolution. Though his business background might have predicted alignment with development-oriented approach Michael had initially pursued, lived experience had apparently cultivated deeper understanding transcending purely commercial evaluation, increasingly dominating standardized industry approaches. The easement prevented specific transformation, but created framework for evolution more aligned with what makes Blackwood genuinely distinctive, Michael acknowledged. Perspective reflecting decade of engagement with balanced approach conservation had structurally ensured. Without that limitation, we might have created financially successful operation, ultimately indistinguishable from countless corporate properties, leveraging wine country aesthetic, while minimizing actual agricultural purpose. This recognition that conservation easement had protected essential qualities transcending purely commercial considerations, represented philosophical alignment that had gradually emerged through lived experience following boundary setting, that initially appeared disruptive to development vision, but increasingly seemed preserving foundation making family legacy genuinely meaningful beyond merely financial calculations or marketing narratives. As evening progressed, conversation turned toward 70-year milestone tomorrow's gathering would commemorate. My father's assumption of full ownership following my grandfather's retirement, transition representing continuity through changing leadership that had characterized Blackwood's successful navigation through agricultural, economic, and social transformations throughout its history. Unlike many family operations failing during generational transitions, our approach had historically balanced respect for established wisdom with openness to appropriate innovation, guided by values transcending individual lifetimes. I've been reviewing transition documentation from each generation, Michael shared. Perspective integrating business expertise with deeper appreciation for philosophical framework, guiding families' approach to succession planning. Each transfer maintained core values while creating space for evolution addressing contemporary challenges. The consistency isn't in specific methods, but in balanced approach, preventing both rigid preservation and wholesale transformation disconnected from foundational purpose. This observation, consistency in philosophical framework rather than particular implementations, reflected sophisticated understanding transcending earlier characterization of heritage as primarily marketable narrative. Within business strategy, the traditional perspectives he had once dismissed as too outdated for wedding ceremony were now recognized as embodying wisdom regarding balanced integration, proven successful through multiple transitions previous generations had navigated, with similar thoughtfulness. The following morning brought perfect early autumn conditions for commemoration gathering. Golden sunshine, moderate temperature, gentle breeze carrying subtle fragrance from heritage roses my grandmother had planted, along pathways connecting residents to winery buildings and vineyard blocks. Unlike elaborately staged wedding that had temporarily transformed Blackwood into event venue emphasizing impression management over agricultural reality, today's celebration centered on working enterprise continuing purpose for which it had been established through balanced approach. Conservation easement had structurally protected. Guests arriving throughout morning represented diverse connections to property's ongoing evolution, neighboring farmers maintaining similar commitment to traditional methods, young winemakers participating in educational programs, sharing disappearing knowledge, community members engaging with agricultural heritage increasingly marginalized by development, transforming working landscapes into lifestyle amenities, family connections extending beyond blood relationship, to include those sharing values, guiding Blackwood's approach to changing circumstances. Unlike wedding guest list, emphasizing strategic relationships, advancing development vision easement, had necessarily limited, today's gathering prioritized authentic connections to property's ongoing purpose, transcending merely social or commercial considerations. The celebration wasn't primarily marketing opportunity or lifestyle statement, but commemoration of values guiding relationship with particular place across generations, facing different challenges through philosophical framework, prioritizing balanced integration of tradition and innovation. As formal ceremony began beneath ancient olive trees, my great-grandfather had transplanted from Italian hillside, Michael surprised me with presentation I hadn't anticipated. Comprehensive documentation he had quietly developed over preceding year with historians and agricultural specialists, creating permanent record of Blackwood's distinctive approach to viticultural challenges across 5 generations. This archive ensures wisdom accumulated through your family's relationship with this particular place remains accessible to future generations facing challenges we can't yet imagine, he explained while displaying leather-bound volumes continuing, documentation tradition established by my great-grandfather, but incorporating contemporary technology making accumulated knowledge more readily accessible beyond physical property boundaries. The project integrated traditional record-keeping approaches with appropriate technological innovations, handwritten journals digitally preserved alongside scientific analysis identifying principles transcending specific implementations, oral histories documenting practical knowledge often omitted from formal records, genetic mapping of heritage vines connecting biological reality to cultural practices, maintaining distinctive characteristics through changing environmental conditions. The conservation easement protects physical property, but this documentation preserves wisdom that transcends particular place, Michael continued. Perspective reflecting decade of engagement with balanced approach boundary setting had structurally ensured. Together, they maintain Blackwood's distinctive character through inevitable transitions that would otherwise risk erasing accumulated knowledge increasingly marginalized by standardized approaches dominating contemporary industry. This initiative, preserving, Wisdom alongside physical property represented meaningful evolution in Michael's understanding of heritage, beyond merely marketable narrative within business strategy. The traditional perspectives he had once dismissed as outdated sentimentality were now recognized as embodying sophisticated knowledge system, balancing scientific understanding with practical wisdom accumulated through generations of thoughtful observation and experimentation. Most significantly, Michael presented framework explaining philosophical principles guiding Blackwood's evolution through agricultural, economic, and social transformations. Previous generations had navigated with similar thoughtfulness. Unlike rigid preservation preventing adaptation to changing circumstances or wholesale transformation disconnected from foundational purpose, this approach maintained core values while creating space for evolution addressing contemporary challenges. Through balanced integration, proven successful across multiple transitions. What appears as tradition versus innovation actually represents continuous conversation between generations facing similar challenges in different contexts, he explained. Perspective reflecting sophisticated understanding transcending earlier. Characterization of heritage as primarily historical artifact rather than living wisdom. The consistency isn't in specific methods, but in balanced approach, preventing both rigid preservation and wholesale transformation disconnected from foundational purpose. This framework, continuous conversation between generations, rather than either static preservation or disconnected innovation, articulated philosophical understanding I had attempted sharing during contentious periods surrounding wedding and subsequent boundary setting. The recognition that emerged through lived experience following conservation easement represented deeper alignment than abstract discussion alone could have achieved regarding values guiding Blackwood's approach to changing circumstances. Following. Formal presentation, gathering transition to interactive demonstrations throughout property, highlighting balanced approach conservation easement had structurally protected when it faced potential erosion through development prioritizing lifestyle. Branding over agricultural purpose. Sophia led Heritage Viticulture Workshop, using great-great-grandfather's pruning tools to demonstrate traditional techniques specifically developed for Sangiovese vines' unique growth patterns. Thomas conducted tasting, comparing wines produced through different methods highlighting distinctive characteristics emerging from balanced integration of traditional approaches and appropriate innovations. Vanessa, whose marketing background had initially shaped understanding prioritizing brand considerations over agricultural reality, now facilitated discussion examining relationship between authentic quality and effective communication sharing distinctive characteristics with appreciative audiences. Rather than creating carefully curated narrative obscuring functional purpose beneath lifestyle aesthetics, her professional expertise now served genuine agricultural mission through educational programs, sharing disappearing knowledge with broader community. Michael guided groups through conservation easement boundaries, explaining how structured limitation preventing development contradicting property's essential character had created framework within which more authentic engagement with Blackwood's distinctive qualities could flourish beyond merely financial or marketing considerations. The boundary setting that had initially appeared disruptive to his development vision was now presented as preserving foundation-making family legacy genuinely meaningful beyond standardized approaches, increasingly dominating contemporary industry. Throughout these demonstrations and discussions, I observed with quiet satisfaction how conservation easement had ultimately fostered deeper appreciation for distinctive qualities Michael had once seemed determined to transform according to standardized commercial frameworks disconnected from agricultural purpose. The exclusion positioning me as too traditional for wedding ceremony had illuminated philosophical divide, requiring boundary-setting conservation easement had structurally implemented through permanent protection of founding property. The lesson, provided through consequence rather than mere conversation, had apparently fostered understanding that abstract discussion alone couldn't have achieved. The limitation preventing transformation, contradicting property's essential character, had created framework ensuring Blackwood would continue expressing particular place through methods balancing tradition and innovation that had always distinguished our family's approach from standardized operations increasingly dominating contemporary industry. As afternoon progressed toward evening celebration, Richard requested private conversation away from gatherings activities, his expressions suggesting reflection transcending immediate circumstances. We settled on familiar bench beneath ancient oak, witnessing 5 generations of family discussions, navigating transitions with similar thoughtfulness to one conservation easement had necessarily guided through structured limitation rather than merely philosophical discussion. I've been thinking about Michael's transformation since conservation easement created necessary recalibration in his approach to Blackwood's legacy. He began. Perspective reflecting unique position, bridging different backgrounds and generations. Throughout property's evolution, the boundary setting that initially appeared confrontational ultimately protected foundation, making his current understanding possible through lived experience rather than abstract discussion. This observation, boundary setting creating space for understanding to develop through direct engagement rather than intellectual conversation, reflected wisdom Richard had developed through decades observing family operations navigate transitions with varying degrees of success or failure. Unlike many succession planning approaches emphasizing either complete authority transfer or rigid preservation preventing evolution, our family had historically balanced respect for established wisdom with openness to appropriate innovation guided by values transcending individual lifetimes. The wedding exclusion revealed fundamental disconnect that likely wouldn't have resolved through continued discussion alone, he continued, perception transcending immediate circumstances to recognize broader patterns. Sometimes values must be demonstrated through consequences rather than merely explained through conversation. The conservation easement created structural reality, making philosophical understanding possible through direct experience that abstract discussion couldn't have achieved. This perspective, boundary setting as potentially constructive rather than merely restrictive intervention, articulated understanding that had gradually emerged through decade following conservation easement's implementation. Though limitation, preventing development had initially appeared disruptive to Michael's vision, lived experience engaging with framework easement created had apparently fostered deeper appreciation for distinctive qualities that transcended purely commercial evaluation, increasingly dominating standardized industry approaches. Michael needed to understand that some values can't be properly honored through narrative alone, but require physical manifestation through actual practices, Richard observed, integrating business understanding with appreciation for agricultural reality beneath viticultural romance, often emphasizing aesthetics over production. The easement preventing physical transformation created space for philosophical transformation that might otherwise have remained abstract concept rather than lived experience. As evening celebration concluded with traditional harvest blessing, connecting present gathering to ceremonies my great-grandfather had established upon founding Blackwood, Michael requested moment addressing assembled community that had developed around property's ongoing agricultural mission. His words reflected perspective integrating business expertise with deeper appreciation for philosophical framework, guiding families' approach to changing circumstances through balanced integration. Conservation easement had structurally protected. 10. Years ago, I mistakenly believed modernization required fundamental transformation away from traditional approaches I characterized as outdated sentimentality, disconnected from contemporary reality. He acknowledged with remarkable self-awareness, indicating genuine evolution rather than merely strategic positioning. I failed to recognize that Blackwood's distinctive character emerged precisely from balanced approach, integrating appropriate innovation with traditional wisdom accumulated through generations of thoughtful engagement with this particular place. This recognition, distinctive character emerging from balanced integration rather than either rigid preservation or wholesale transformation, articulated philosophical understanding. Conservation easement had structurally ensured through permanent Protection of founding property. Though limitation preventing development had initially appeared disruptive to vision-pursuing standardized luxury model, lived experience engaging with framework easement created had apparently fostered deeper appreciation for distinctive qualities, transcending purely commercial considerations. The conservation easement I initially viewed as obstruction based in outdated sentimentality has proven foundation for more meaningful innovation than development vision might have generated despite its apparent ambition, he continued. Perspective reflecting decade engaging with balanced approach boundary setting had structurally ensured. The limitation preventing specific transformation created framework within which Blackwood's genuine distinctiveness could continue flourishing beyond standardized approaches, increasingly dominating contemporary industry. This framing, limitation, fostering distinctiveness rather than merely restricting opportunity, reflected sophisticated understanding transcending earlier characterization of heritage as primarily marketable narrative within business strategy. The traditional perspectives once dismissed as too outdated for wedding ceremony were now recognized as embodying wisdom regarding balanced integration, proven successful through multiple transitions previous generations had navigated with similar thoughtfulness. A decade ago, I told my mother she was too traditional for my wedding ceremony, excluding her from celebration on land her family had cultivated for 5 generations, Michael concluded, directly addressing uncomfortable truth conservation. Easement had necessarily illuminated through boundary setting, protecting founding property from transformation, contradicting its essential character. That exclusion revealed fundamental misunderstanding of what heritage actually means. Not as curated narrative or marketable aesthetic, but as living wisdom guiding thoughtful adaptation through changing circumstances while maintaining connection to foundational purpose. This acknowledgement, exclusion reflecting fundamental misunderstanding rather than legitimate aesthetic consideration, represented philosophical alignment that had gradually emerged through lived experience following conservation easements implementation. Though boundary setting had initially created tension surrounding wedding celebration, subsequent engagement with framework easement established had apparently fostered deeper understanding regarding values guiding Blackwood's approach to changing circumstances through balanced integration of tradition and innovation. As gathering concluded with traditional wine-sharing ceremony connecting present celebration to practices my great-grandfather had established, I observed with quiet satisfaction how conservation easement had ultimately protected foundation, making Blackwood genuinely distinctive within increasingly standardized industry. The physical boundary preventing development had created space for philosophical understanding to develop through direct engagement rather than abstract discussion alone, fostering appreciation for values that transcended purely commercial considerations, increasingly dominating contemporary approaches. 15 years after telling me I was too traditional for his wedding, Michael now leads educational programs sharing disappearing agricultural knowledge with next generation seeking alternatives to standardized approaches. Vanessa applies her marketing expertise toward authentic communication, connecting appreciative audiences to distinctive qualities emerging from balanced integration of tradition and innovation. Sophia and Thomas continue learning viticultural practices, connecting them directly to wisdom accumulated through 5 previous generations facing different challenges through similar philosophical framework, prioritizing balanced approach, conservation easement structurally protected. The property deed showing my name as sole owner of Founders Hill, document that had revealed development vision's fundamental impossibility, now hangs framed in educational center beside conservation easement, ensuring physical property will continue expressing particular place through methods balancing tradition and innovation that have always distinguished our family's approach from standardized operations. The boundary setting that initially appeared confrontational ultimately protected foundation, making Blackwood's current flourishing possible beyond merely financial calculations or marketing narratives. As twilight transforms brilliant California, sunshine into softer golden light filtering through ancient olive trees my great-grandfather transplanted from Italian hillside, I watch Michael sharing traditional grape pressing techniques with group of young winemakers seeking alternatives to industrial methods increasingly dominating contemporary production. His words echo perspective that has emerged through decade following conservation easements implementation, wisdom that transcends specific disagreements naturally continuing to shape Blackwood's evolution through changing circumstances. Some inheritances can't be measured in property values or production statistics. The true legacy isn't physical assets, but values guiding how we engage with particular place across generations, facing different challenges through philosophical framework, prioritizing balanced integration of tradition and innovation. Some lessons about respect and family heritage can only be taught through consequences that reveal what matters most when everything else changes. The wedding that temporarily revealed fundamental disconnect between competing visions for Blackwood's future ultimately initiated recalibration, preserving balanced approach that had always characterized our family's navigation through agricultural, economic, and social transitions. The exclusion positioning me as too traditional for ceremony celebrating relationship on land my family had cultivated for 5 generations illuminated philosophical divide requiring boundary-setting conservation easement structurally implemented through permanent protection of founding property. The lesson provided through consequence rather than mere conversation fostered understanding abstract discussion alone couldn't have achieved. The limitation preventing transformation, contradicting property's essential character, created framework ensuring Blackwood would continue expressing particular place through methods balancing tradition and innovation that have always distinguished our family's approach from standardized operations increasingly dominating contemporary industry. The conservation easement protecting Founders Hill from development wasn't primarily rejection of progress, but affirmation of values guiding thoughtful evolution through changing circumstances while maintaining connection to foundational purpose. The boundary setting that initially appeared confrontational ultimately protected foundation, making Blackwood's distinctive character possible beyond merely financial calculations or marketing narratives, increasingly dominating standardized approaches, disconnected from particular places and practices, making wine truly meaningful expression beyond merely commercial product. 3 weeks after my son told me I was too traditional to attend his modern wedding, I handed him the deed showing my name as sole owner of the venue he'd planned to transform into luxury development. The conservation easement I established wasn't primarily rejection of his vision, but protection of values, making Blackwood genuinely distinctive when everything else changes. Some lessons about respect and family heritage can only be taught through consequences that reveal what matters most.